Every single bronze sword you've ever seen in a museum carries a secret. Look at the blade, the color, the weight. That weapon represents one of the most sophisticated supply chains ever assembled in the ancient world. And we have absolutely no idea where most of the pieces came from. Here is the problem. Bronze is not a natural rock you dig from the ground. It is a recipe. 9 parts copper, 1 part tin. Mix them together, and you get something harder, sharper, and more valuable than either metal alone. Copper is relatively common, but tin is the ghost in the machine. Without tin, the Bronze Age literally does not happen. No weapons, no automat, no tools, no trade networks stretching across continents. And yet, when archaeologists dig through the ruins of the greatest empires of the ancient Near East, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Mycenaeans, they find the finished bronze everywhere, but the tin mines are nowhere nearby. Which means one of two things is true. Either these civilizations were pulling metal from sources so far away that the distances seem impossible for their technology, or we are fundamentally misunderstanding how their world worked. Welcome to the Lost Tin Route. To understand why this matters, you need to grasp the economics of desperation. Imagine you are a king in 1400 BCE. Your army needs bronze. Your farmers need bronze. Your prestige depends on bronze. But the tin required to make it exist in only a handful of places on Earth, and none of them are inside your kingdom. You are not buying metal from a neighboring province. You are depending on a supply line that might begin 2,000 miles away, cross multiple borders, change hands a dozen times, and pass through territories where your laws mean nothing. You are hostage to a network you cannot see, control, or even fully understand. And if that network breaks, your civilization goes back to the Stone Age. So where was it all coming from? For decades, archaeologists assumed the answer was simple. Cornwall, the southwest tip of Britain. Prehistoric mines at places like Carnon Valley and Dartmoor were producing tin. Phoenician sailors, the master traders of the Mediterranean, must have sailed north, loaded their ships, and brought the metal south to the great cities of the Bronze Age. It is a clean story. It fits on a map. There's only one issue. The timeline might be wrong. The chemical signatures do not always match. And some of the tin found in ancient Mesopotamia and the Levant appears to have come from the opposite direction entirely. Look east, not west, past the Zagros Mountains, into Afghanistan, specifically the Badakhshan region. High in the Hindu Kush, miners were extracting cassiterite, the tin ore, from streams and mountains. Isotope analysis of tin ingots found in the eastern Mediterranean suggests that some of this metal traveled over 2,000 miles. Think about what that journey actually looked like. Miners in the Hindu Kush extract. Local traders carry it down to the Oxus River. It moves across Central Asia, possibly through the Bactria-Marjana archaeological complex, a network of fortified settlements that acted as way stations for luxury goods. Then it enters Iran. It passes through Elamite territory. It crosses the Iranian plateau. It enters Mesopotamia. It goes to Babylon, to Assur, to the Hittite capital of Hattusa. Each step requires new carriers, new merchants, new negotiations, new bribes, new protection payments. By the time that tin reaches a bronze workshop in Canaan, it has been handled by people speaking 5 different languages, none of whom have ever met the original miner or the final swords. But here's where the story gets strange. We know this happened because of the chemistry. Tin from different regions carries different isotopic fingerprints. When scientists analyze Bronze Age artifact from Greece, Turkey, and the Levant, they find tin that chemically matches Afghan sources. But they also find tin that matches Cornwall, and tin that matches Anatolia, and tin that matches sources we have not even identified yet. Which means we're not looking for one lost route. We're looking for a constantly shifting web of routes. A network that rerouted itself based on war, politics, weather, price. The tin trade was not a highway. It was a living organism. Consider the Yalubran shipwreck. Off the coast of Turkey, dating to around 1300 BCE, a merchant vessel sank carrying 10 tons of copper, a ton of terebinth resin, ivory, gold, silver, ebony, and, crucially, about a ton of tin. The copper came from Cyprus. That is certain. But the tin? Isotope studies suggest it probably came from Afghanistan or possibly Central Asia. It was already old when it sank, meaning it had been circulating through the trade network for years. This was not a direct shipment from mine to market. This was a commodity that had been bought, sold, and transported through multiple intermediaries before it ever touched that ship's deck. Now, imagine the psychology of the merchant who loaded that tin. He did not know it came from the Hindu Kush. He probably bought it from a middleman in Ugarit, a thriving port city in modern Syria. Ugarit was the Dubai of the late Bronze Age, a place where Mycenaean Greeks, Hittites, Egyptians, and Canaanite traders met to exchange goods they had carried from the edges of the known world. The merchant knew tin was valuable. He knew it was scarce. He knew that if he could get it to the right workshop, he would make a profit that could change his life. But he had no concept of the original mine. To him, the supply chain began at the port. Everything before that was darkness. This is the hidden economics of the Bronze Age. We tend to imagine ancient empires as self-contained units. The Hittite Empire controlled this territory. The Egyptian Empire controlled that territory. But to expose the lie, these civilizations were not self-contained. They were nodes in a globalized network that would not be matched again for 2,000 years. And the people who controlled the choke points, the mountain passes, the river crossings, the port cities, held power that rivaled kings. The Assyrian merchant colonies in Anatolia give us a glimpse of how this worked. In the 19th century BCE, Assyrian traders established harems, commercial districts in Anatolian cities. They left us thousands of clay tablets describing their business. They were importing tin, but the tablets reveal something fascinating. The price of tin fluctuated wildly. It was subject to tariffs, taxes, and transport fees that doubled its cost every few hundred miles. The Assyrians were not just moving metal. They were managing risk. They were hedging against bandits, against political instability, against the weather. They were playing a game that looks remarkably similar to modern commodity trading, except one lost caravan meant bankruptcy or death. But who controlled the source? That is the question that haunts archaeologists. If the tin came from Afghanistan, who controlled the mountains? The answer might be nobody we would recognize as a state. Small-scale mining communities, possibly operating seasonally, extracting or from alluvial deposits in river valleys. They would trade with local strongmen, who traded with caravanners, who traded with the great powers. The bronze empires of the Mediterranean were dependent on, and possibly being manipulated by, mountain miners they never met and could not conquer. Then, around 1200 BCE, the network shattered. We call it the Bronze Age collapse. Within a few decades, the Hittite Empire vanished. The Mycenaean palaces burned. Egypt survived, but as a shadow of itself. Ugarit was destroyed so thoroughly that it was forgotten for 3,000 years. The causes are still debated. Climate change, drought, earthquakes, invasions, systems collapse. But look at it through the lens of tin. When the trade routes became unstable, when the caravans stopped coming, when the Elubrant-style ships stopped sailing, the bronze stopped flowing. And without bronze, you cannot maintain the military advantage that keeps your empire together. You cannot produce the tools that feed your cities. You cannot project power. This is not to say that losing tin caused the collapse. The causes were complex and interconnected, but tin reveals the vulnerability. These civilizations had built pyramids of complexity on foundations of sand. They had created systems so specialized, so dependent on long-distance trade, that when the network hiccuped, the entire structure trembled. The kings who thought they ruled empires were actually managing supply chain. And when the supply chains broke, the kings disappeared. After the collapse, something strange happened. The world entered a tin dark age. Not because tin stopped existing, but because the routes were lost. The knowledge evaporated. For centuries, bronze production declined. When the metal reappeared in the archaeological record, it often came from different sources, moved through different networks. The lost tin route was not just a physical path. It was a set of relationships, agreements, and institutional knowledge that took centuries to build and only decades to forget. Why is it so hard to find? Why, 3,000 years later, are we still arguing about where the tin came from? Because tin leaves almost no trace. Unlike copper, which requires massive mining operations visible from space, tin can be extracted from surface deposits, from streams, from small-scale digs that erode within decades. The caravans traveled through mountain passes and deserts where nothing rots. The ships that carried it sank, but tin ingots dissolve or scatter. The merchants kept records on perishable materials, or on clay tablets that shattered, or in languages we cannot read. And here is the cruelest trick: bronze can be recycled. When a sword breaks, you melt it down. When an empire falls, Looters collect the metal. The tin keeps circulating, but its origin story gets lost. We are looking for a ghost that haunts every bronze artifact ever made, but left no forwarding address. And yet, the search continues. Every year, new isotope studies narrow the possibilities. Every shipwreck discovered adds another piece to the puzzle. We now know that tin from Cornwall did reach the Mediterranean, but perhaps later than we thought and in smaller quantities. We know that Central Asian tin moved west, but probably through different intermediaries than we imagined. We know that some civilizations, like the Hittites, stockpiled tin, creating strategic reserves that suggest they understood their vulnerability all too well. This is the real lesson. The ancient world was not a collection of isolated civilizations rising and falling on their own merit. It was a web of interdependence so complex that the people living inside it could not see the whole shape. A king in Hattusa could issue commands that were obeyed within miles of his palace, but he was fundamentally dependent on a miner in Afghanistan, a merchant in Babylon, and a sailor in Ugarit whom he would never meet. Power in the Bronze Age was not just about armies. It was about logistics. It was about the ability to keep a thin thread of connection open across 2,000 miles of mountains, deserts, and hostile territory. We remember the pharaohs. We remember the conquests. We remember the art, but we have forgotten the routes. We have forgotten that every bronze blade represents a miracle of coordination, a triumph of human connection over geography, a network of trust stretched so thin it was miraculous it held together at all. The next time you see a bronze artifact in a museum, look past the craftsmanship, look past the patina. That object is a fossil of a relationship. It is proof that 3,000 years ago, someone stood in a mountain stream in the Hindu Kush, washed tin ore from the gravel, and started a journey that would end in the hands of a soldier on a battlefield in Greece who would never know where his weapon be. The route is lost, the metal remains, and the silence between those two facts is where the real history lives.